So how far would you go to make the game you're working on sound good? How about this?
At Ubisoft, we strive to create believable worlds where the player can spend their time. And in order pursuing that authenticity, I went to the island of Cuba to record ambiences and birds and animals that you couldn't usually find in commercial sound libraries. I did 2 trips with part of my team where we drove around the island recording the main biomes, that is the natural formations that are represented in the game.
That is Eduardo Vaisman, the Bafta-nominated audio director for FarCry at Ubisoft. Seema and I talked to him about that trip, how the sound design was done for FarCry6, the difference between sound design for movies and games, and what Eduardo personally was able to bring to the story and themes of the game. This was a really fun interview, and I do hope you like it. Let's get into it.
This is Behind the Games from NewOverlords.com, where we seek creators of all kinds to find out what's behind our favorite games. With your hosts, Jeff and Seema.
From the New Overlords Midwest studio, I'm Jeff Villamek.
And I'm Seema from the Northeast studio.
And today we're joined by Eduardo Vaisman, the audio director at Ubisoft Toronto, who's doing all the sound on the FarCry series. Eduardo, hello.
Hello, how are you, Jeff? How are you, Seema? It's a pleasure to be with you today.
We are so glad to have you here. We've been thinking about audio for quite a while. We've talked to a couple audio leads in other places, but some of the work you've done has been pretty amazing. And I know we're going to get into some really exciting ways you've gone out into the field and dealt with audio. But I wanted to start with your journey. I know you had sort of a interesting journey getting to Ubisoft Toronto. Why don't we hear a little bit of that background to kick things off?
Okay, thank you. The journey comes from a little bit behind on time. As you maybe notice in my accent, I'm not from Toronto. I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina. That's where I was born and raised. And I start with my journey in audio, actually professionally, in 1992, working in film and in an old big film studio, and working with tape, sprocket mag, the reel-to-reel tapes and everything. Then I live part of my life also in Mexico City, and in 2007, I immigrated to Canada, and I was lucky enough to be hired by Ubisoft to make video games and transition from film to games. And I've been doing that for the last 11 years here at Ubisoft Toronto.
I will certainly ask you in just a bit about that transition from film to games, because I've learned a little bit about the background and the complexities that games have over film, which I think is really interesting. But I wanted to start with one of your recent journeys. So you've worked on many of the Far Cry titles. FarCry6 is set in a unique South American, more tropical environment, and you journeyed out into the wilderness for a long trek to go and collect sound. So why don't we talk about that, and then that'll lead into us describing sort of how you do that and day in the life, and we'll pepper you with questions on tools and process.
Yeah, FarCry6, for those that who don't know the game, is an open world action adventure narrative driven game with a first person shooter is the main mechanic. And the Far Cry series, in every installment, is set in a different, let's say, imaginary country or environment. Far Cry 6 was set in the Latino Caribbean island of Yara, which is inspired mainly in Cuba, but not only in Cuba. It has parts of Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, and other countries from the Caribbean and Central America region. And and at Ubisoft, we strive to create believable worlds where the player can spend their time, and in order pursuing that uh, that authenticity, I went to the island of Cuba to record ambiances and birds and animals that you couldn't usually find in commercial sound libraries. So I did 2 trips with part of my team where we drove around the island recording the main biomes, that is the natural formations that are represented in the game.
So you were out in the wilderness collecting sounds. How much sound recording did you end up doing over that amount of time?
Well, it was close to 50 hours. And the way we plan it sounds easy, but it's a hard work. Is we need to first trying to find the areas that relate to the areas portrayed in the game
Right.
the best way possible. So if we have uh, beaches with rocks, try to find the place where that happened. If we have cliff, try to find an area with cliff and check and mark all the national parks where you can find that flora and fauna. And then you need to record day and night because it's an open
Oh,
world game with a 24-hour cycle. So you need to have the feeling and the ambience during the day, during the night, dusk and dawn. Sometimes you need to record somewhere during the day, and then you need to move to another place. And by night, like 1, 2 a.m., you need to return to the same place or find another place that sounds pretty much like the one you were before. So you can capture full cycle day and night of every location.
Interesting.
did you ever run into any situations where you were looking for a particular thing and couldn't find it, like a particular animal or a particular setting? Or you had to
No,
wait for one to show up, for instance?
Right.
I
Hunting them down?
I don't think so, because when I go into that type of journeys, I'm more on the receiving end, what the environment and the nature is going to give me, rather than what
Oh,
I'm looking into. So I'm
Okay.
not
yes.
forcing to walk. I will sit here until the cheetah, will show up like a BBC documentary. It's like,
Right.
okay, I'm here. I open my ears and say, oh, and most of the stuff I haven't been there before. So it's like, okay, nature surprised me. I knew that, like for example, there were 27 species of endemic birds that only existed in Cuba, or subspecies. And I wanted to have that. And when I went to national parks, I asked the guards of the national parks, what are can I find, for example, the tocororo here is the Cuban national bird, or can I find the cartacuba here? So and they told me, yeah, you will find their nests on that area. And I was walking in that direction, but it's not that I was looking for something that I need to get this elephant. And
Right.
So it was like a real world sandbox for you.
oh, yes, yes, yes.
And collecting those sounds ahead of time, not that you had a script and you had to go line by line in the script and get each thing. So you didn't have to go into the jungle and find a dachshund in the jungle to get the proper sounds for chorizo,
Yeah.
which is lucky. 'Cause I don't know
No,
how
the,
that would
the, the
work.
type of captures for that type of field recording is aimed to recreate the environment the in the best way possible, and to be truthful to what the procedural biomes we create in the engine uh, are are showing, because there are other departments and they study what type of plants, the geographical formations, how the tectonic planks were arranged and why you have a mountain here and the beach is there. So there's a lot of research behind. I'm just trying to honor that research with sound.
That sounds amazing. It sounds like, as you're describing it, scientific research. Especially, I did a search of are there libraries of these kinds of sounds out there in the scientific community, I would bet, especially with the bird sounds you got, that seems to be an area of science research where they're collecting sounds. I would bet they would love to get their hands on some of those bird sounds that you collected and put it into a couple of the global collections that are out there.
Yeah, there's an amazing place in the state called the Cornell laboratory. They
Or no?
collect birds from all around the world, and I would say it's a main source of research for many sound designers. I want to know how the bird sounds in Indonesia, and I get to their website, and they have the biggest catalog of wildlife,
Yeah.
especially birds, that that I've heard. So it's a big source of inspiration.
What tools did you bring out with you into the field? What recording equipment did you have out
We
there?
brought several portable recorders, and there I borrow few more microphones from because I work making films in Mexico. I made good friends with filmmakers in Cuba. So when I was there, I visit them and say, I can I borrow a couple of additional mics, and we recorded in stereo. I have an ambisonics recording myself, and we usually pointed the mics to different direction beside doing the typical XY stereo capture or MS that are microphone techniques. We also pointed into different directions because when we returned here to the studio, we created first order ambisonics ambiances using tools and based on the stereo or 4 tracks recordings we did.
And that ambisonics, for people that aren't familiar, that puts it in a framework, an audio framework that allows it to be mapped into a 3D space, right?
Exactly. So the ambisonic ambience, the first order at least, is like taking a picture of everything that is surrounding you and encoding it in a 4-channel track that then is decoded. But the good things with ambisonic is that it's what we called a channel agnostic format. So if you have stereo, it decodes in stereo. If you have quad, it decodes in quad. If you have 7.1, it opens very nicely, regardless the amount of channels you have at the output.
So what do you hope someone listening, what do you hope their setup is to take the best advantage of
Yeah.
FarCry6?
What I hope is that the player feel that Yara is a real place. That is not something they listen at usually, is not their usual environment, and that sounds exotic. I don't want that to be the focal point. Is there is a beautiful background. It's basically creating the stage for the rest of the stories and mechanics and everything that happens in the game. I don't want to feel like they heard that before and that is something that is out of place, or if they are surprised, as I was surprised when listening, for example, to the mangrove. I went to some mangrove area and I was expecting insects and birds and everything. It was quieter than a recording booth. Zero sound,
Wow.
completely dead. So I needed to, in those cases, bring some imagination on to make it a bit more alive.
Right.
You had to
Right.
come up with something.
Yeah, that's where you start telling a story that is not necessarily a physical simulation of the space, but you need to put your own brushstrokes to make it more interesting. At night, yeah, you have frogs and it's like a life, like Sonic life comes up mostly at night. But during the day is like desert, nothing. You can force your preamps, you only get the hiss of the electronics.
Wow.
Interesting. Wow. A lot of nocturnal life, I guess. And I wonder if the structure of the plants just absorb sound in that case.
Yeah, maybe because there's no too much wildlife in that part of the mangroves, at least.
And the water must not be moving at all either.
The water is still dead.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
there's no waves or anything. Eh, but probably I got more like flies, flying in front of the
Right.
microphone, like
Buzzing,
flies pass by,
flying on by.
more than anything else.
And then, Seema, I think you were also asking, why don't you continue that question?
Right. So
'Cause I
if
think there's an interesting part
if
of it.
someone's listening to, for instance, FarCry6, what kind of equipment do you wish they had? Like, I generally play with the headset, but would I hear more if I had like a surround sound setup or?
That is it's a good question. I really don't expect the people to have anything to enjoy our games. I create the soundtrack with the consumer in mind. So
Mm-hmm.
video games, let's face it, is a household appliance that is mostly played in living rooms and in bedrooms, with the sound coming from their TVs. Most of the people,
Yeah.
headphones. If I'm lucky, if I'm even luckier, they have additional speakers beside their TV. And if I am the luckiest guy in the world, they have a home theater. But we know that is not the truth. So um, I need, let's say, to make the player who invested in a 5.1 or 7.1 home theater to feel rewarded for their investment. But at the same time, I need to make feel the player who plays in headphones or in their TV speaker not to feel bad because, I probably could enjoy the game more if I had more money to afford this. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that is the way I mix in a room with a 5.1. We are upgrading now to a 7.1 and Atmos here, but that is to provide the high end with the best experience. But I play with cans a lot, and I go back and
Okay.
forth from expensive speakers to headphones to cheap stereo speakers, and sometimes I play through the TV here and the TV speakers and say, okay, I need to still enjoy the experience for every possible situation.
That's interesting and makes a lot of sense. If in my life, when I was developing software, no matter what the application was, we would want to test it on every platform, every tool set, every user interface where the users would potentially be running the software. You're going to be running it on a phone, or you're going to be running on a big desktop, or you're going to be running it on multiple monitors. Make sure you're not designing for only the high end or only the low end, but be able to scale across those experiences is pretty
Yeah,
I mean,
crucial.
that's a challenge I hadn't even thought of.
yeah, that's the car
Right.
radio test. You mix your song in a studio, and then you run to your car to see, okay, if I'm listening this
Oh
in the
my God.
radio, how would it sound here?
Right.
On the high end, when you're in the studio and say 7.1 Atmos setup, what does that look like? Is it a big room and you actually have speakers around the room
It's
that
we have
when you're gonna
three
build that out?
studios, audio rooms here at the Ubisoft Toronto, um, with different sizes. One is like small living room. This one is one of the studios I'm now. Is, let's say, a bedroom, a bit bigger, and then we have one that is smaller, so we can also move the game from studio to studio and compare with different cubic volumes.
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I understand, and this gets into the differences between creating movie sounds versus creating game sounds, is when you create a movie, you have a script and you have a layout and you know what's going to happen from moment to moment. And you can structure the sound and tell the story through those moments. In a video game, often you don't know what's going to happen from moment to moment because it's driven by the character, and the character's running around and they decide to jump off a cliff, or they encounter a crocodile. Does that resonate? Is that something, a challenge that you've had to deal with, that layering of sounds, the dynamic nature? And is that one of the key differences? And what other differences do you see between movie and video
Oh,
game
there are
sound
a lot.
design?
I have a small anecdote. When I was hired by Ubisoft Toronto, I had no previous experience in games, and I knew, and the job post said, we need someone with 5 years with video game experience or more than 10 years in a related field. I had at that time close to 20 years making films. I made more than around 60 feature films for 6 different countries. I did field recording, sound effects editing, dialogue editing, pre-recording mixer in a Dolby stage, lots of stuff. So I say, okay, I will apply. I showed up. Let's see how it goes. And I was confident that with my experience in film, I would be pretty okay in the game arena. And the person who interviewed me, that was my first boss, Fabien, he told me, you know how to tell stories with sound, but sound for game is a complete different animal, and it's going to take you at least 2 years to understand that. And at the beginning, I say, oh,
Mm.
2 years really? And not only he was right, he fell short. I would say that I understood how it takes to make a AAA game after shipping my third AAA game. and and there's a lot of differences, especially for this size of the games. And I give you one example that pretty much shows where the differences are. A typical feature film has around 1,500 lines of dialogue. FarCry 6 had 75,000 lines of dialogue. So it's the
Wow.
equivalent of putting 50 feature films side to side just for the dialogue. So the sheer amount of assets we create for the game. FarCry 6 has probably close to 250,000 sounds, in the we shipped with, including the dialogue. And when the experience of a film is 2 hours, the experience in Far Cry 6 is 40 to 60, let's say, hours, if you go for
Right.
platinum or more. So I think when we create those parallels, especially with AAA and film industry, we should compare probably with making 4 or 5 seasons of an HBO or Netflix series rather than
Okay.
one film. And
Got it.
that's
Got it.
also one of the reasons why it takes 3 years, 4 years to ship these monster games, because it's a lot of work involved.
Right. Right. That's amazing. And that connection to seasons of a TV show, I think, really puts it together and is a good parallel. Something, especially something like Lost, where it's in a tropical environment, maybe it would get a lot closer. There's potentially gunshot sounds. There's probably a lot more. They're collecting probably quite a few sounds along the way, but even then, probably not nearly close to what you've got collected, for one.
Hmm.
And for two, again, the way it's structured so that the game can dynamically be putting these sounds together and they don't conflict and they don't clash. and whatever you're doing while soundtrack music is playing still makes sense and everything sort of layers all properly. It just seems like a hugely complex problem.
Yes, I think the trick is in the mix. In a film, you have the audience where you want them. They are sit in the dark, watching your screen. You got them. So you can tell the
Mm-hmm.
story the way you want. You guide them through your journey, telling that story, and shot by shot, you design what is the important. In games, the mix needs to give the player narrative elements, gameplay elements, not to be frustrated. Why I died here. I don't know who shot me, and make the experience enjoyable, moment to moment, giving the player full agency. So you own the camera, you own the microphone, you go where you want, and everything needs to sound fine. It's like I give you a musical instrument, and even if you don't if you don't know how to play it, you play something and it sounds nice. You throw a
Right.
grenade
Yeah.
while taking an outpost and then riding a horse and jump into a jeep and then dive into the ocean, and it sounds good no matter what you do or when you do it.
There's parts of the game where you are in tunnels or inside a building, and you're still bringing your same weapon that you were just using outside, and there's various layers of music that will come up. Like you get a big battle going inside of a compound when I'm burning down fields, and big rockin' soundtrack comes up. That the complexity of playing all of those sounds, are there tools and systems that will put some of that together for you or help to create
Yeah.
echo or take a sound and now make it echoey? Or do you have to produce those sounds in different environments or re-encode them for those situations? So when I move into the underground tunnel and shoot my gun, it sounds like this.
So
How does
we
that work?
have uh, different parallel systems. So in the engine, from when you move from one place to the other, you have what we call environmental reverbs. So we set the space with reverbs that could be convolution reverbs based on impulse responses and or algorithmic reverbs. And then you have in the, for example, the guns are a different story because one of the signature sound of the gun is their tail. You have the
Mm-hmm.
shot and the tail of the shot, the pow, and that changes from interior to exterior uh, a lot, and is very difficult to replicate just with reverb. It sounds very muffled. So you create the gun and you create the tail for that gun for different environments. And
I
so the
see.
gun, every time you shoot a weapon, is actually a combination of several layers. Some are exciting the environmental reverb, and depending where you are, you're hearing the tail, which usually is could be quad or stereo, depending how big is the place. That is also another layer in the weapon. So now imagine to do
Interesting.
that for 95 weapons, I think we have in Far Cry 6.
Yeah, I mean, every 5 minutes, you're picking up a new gun off the
Yeah.
ground.
And then on top of that, there's music or no music
Oh,
in
yeah.
certain scenes.
And there's your dialogue, and
Yep.
and you have the UI feedbacks, and you have the enemy feedbacks, and you have the NPC barks and combat battle cries and everything, and it all needs to work. So we have several mixing systems and approach that we use in every scenario. So it's not just a pushing and pulling faders like you would do a with a film or with music, but we have scenes. It's like a mix preset in your giant mixing board that changes frame to frame. Then we have what we call high dynamic range mixing, which sets a loudness window that moves up and down, prioritizing what is important from moment to moment for the player to listen. And because there's a point where
Got
you
it.
cannot go louder. So what you need to do
Right.
is duck everything else. So
Right.
what is the loudest, what is the most important person in this frame? Is the first person gun, let's say. So when the gun is here, the moment the gun is shooting, the ambience magically disappear because it would be
That's interesting.
creating masking a physical, sound physical effect that I don't want. So I remove what is in the way to focus on what will maximize the experience for the player.
That kind of direction of auto ducking of other having the tool to be able to do some of that is interesting, but then the direction which you're describing, which is you're going to be following the narrative, looking at the scene, imagining what happens, and then assigning the priority as that scene evolves. That just seems like a really interesting
I
part of
think
the audio direction
it's the
process.
most fun, I have because I started as a sound designer in the studio with Splinter Cell Blacklist. Then I moved to lead audio in Far Cry 4 with some with 5 special missions where the player was transported to a mythical map that was part of the world of Kirat. Then I moved into Far Cry Primal, that was a game set in Mesolithic era. You play
Right.
almost as a caveman. It's not a first-person shooter. We said it was a
Hard to get dinosaur
first-person.
sounds
Yeah,
out and track those
we
out in
said
a
it
while.
was a first-person clubber because you work with a club. Just, there's no guns there. It's just a bow and arrow and spears. And then Far Cry 5, where was a bigger mandate. In Toronto, we did the North region, the Jacob Seed, for the ones who played the game. And we were also in
Right.
charge of the 2 hours and something of cinematics. And in Far Cry 6, that was the moment where I was, let's say, in control of the mix. And it's what
Okay.
I like to do the most in audio is the mixing part. And that's where I could apply my role as director, manifesting from moment to moment what is the intention of the game, what is the purpose of everything that you're playing, and reflect that through the mix.
I imagine at those points in time when you're creating that audio direction and directing where the audio is going to come up and down, you're probably collaborating with a bunch of other
Oh
people
yeah,
too, right? The writers and the narrative directors. And what does that team look like on such a huge game like this and the people that you end up working with the most?
well, in a game like Far Cry 6, the whole team is a head count of around 800 people
Wow.
Wow.
in multiple studios, sometimes up to 10 studios around the world. I work with at least 4 different time zones in every project. So let's talk about only the audio team. The audio team was the main part of it was the core team here in Toronto. Then we have the main co-dev team in Montreal. Then we have another part of the team in Berlin, and another part of the team in Shanghai. And we also collaborated closely with our studio in Ukraine, in Kiev. And so you rely a lot on your team because imagine that the human effort and talent and artistry necessary to create all those sounds and is incredible. And you have the voice designers recording a cast of 90 actors day and night in also in different countries through COVID. That's another story. And
Mhm.
so, but for the decisions is video games, especially these big ones, is a big collaborative effort. So there's no rogue or mavericks here that say no, I do this because sound design is not an art that can exist in the vacuum. So what we do,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
we always do it applied to a creative vision, an art direction, animation. So we are always enhancing, empowering, and complementing other disciplines. And if I were just doing sound design for the sake of sound design, probably I would be uh, a musician making concrete music, with sounds.
Right.
But let's say it's more like an applied art. So you complement this, everything is intertwined and everything crosses
Right.
audio.
Right.
UI crosses audio, AI, interface, gameplay, narrative. So we touch a little bit of everything and everything affects audio. So it's a running joke. And when there's a change and someone say, "Oh, but this is not affecting audio," I don't believe it.
Lies.
There's the reason why the bard in every game is considered a support player because they're enhancing everybody else's contributions, just like you
That's a
do.
good
Yeah.
analogy.
Yes.
Eduardo is the bard supporting all of Ubisoft from the sidelines on his team,
Yeah.
or in the middle of it more than the sidelines.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good analogy. And yeah, so communication is key. So because for these things to happen, first I need to be super clear of what is the audio vision and what is my purpose doing something, so the rest of the disciplines can understand. And if I don't really get what they are trying to do, trying to get to the bottom of their purpose, so they see in audio an ally on taking some gameplay mechanics or feature to the place where they want that to be.
That's really good insight into understanding all of those layers and that constellation of people that come together with such a big game like FarCry 6, and all of the Far Cry series. That narrative driven story that you're playing through, as you said, it's like playing through a TV series or playing through multiple movies because because the narrative and the story is such a central element that does seem to necessitate understanding the story, understanding the goal, and having audio and sound design and everything come together to drive that narrative forward.
And what you said
That's really
about
interesting.
communication echoes what we heard from a game designer, nothing to do with audio, but he also said communication is key. So it's from all those groups that you mentioned, everyone. There's nobody just working in a corner doing their own thing, it sounds like.
No, it's impossible. And talking about narrative, I created a very nice bond with Navid Javari, our narrative director in FarCry 6, because I also, as a Latino, I brought my point of view on authenticity as well,
Mhm.
and proper cultural representation. We had consultants and expert in sensitivities and everything, but being like a Latino in a direction in a director position, I think that also helped to round up this idea of authenticity and proper representation, because there's these two things. me as a Latino and me with the experience of living under a military dictatorship in my young years in Argentina. So I had an idea. So what is being living in a dictatorship? What you can feel, in the street? What is that sense of propaganda and oppression and things that I try to reflect in Yara, as part of the world building.
Right.
Not to make a deep reflection because it's not probably the proper space, but to get the player closer to a reality that they haven't experienced through me, that I had the real
Right.
experience.
That's amazing and really speaks to what my experience was playing through the game, in that you do get the feel and you do see the elements of propaganda that are sort of dispersed around the island as you're navigating. But it's not as simple as every person out there is a bad guy. And all of the bad guys have red nameplates and you go and just shoot every bad guy. And even when there are bad guys, you can take the path and probably do operate in this kind of environment in the real world where you put your gun away and you just, drive down the street and pass up a checkpoint and it's okay. And as long as you're not being aggressive, but you do have a sense of tension and you do feel the propaganda of the signs and the speakers playing. And that it felt really impactful to me even playing through it and experiencing that and thinking about and putting myself in that situation, so I felt that come through in the narrative. That is pretty educational just to hear about that from your perspective and where that's coming
Yeah,
from.
that was a cool thing in this Far Cry, not to be the player and everyone else is hostile. And
Right,
because in a dictatorship, you have the people, the regime, considered enemy of the states. They are uh, hostile directly against the people they deem the enemy, and the rest of the population, they live under a police state and a constant vigilant. But as long as they do what they regularly do, go to work, have fun, consume, go back home, don't talk too much, etc., they don't raise any alarm. And the country, even if under a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime, needs to keep working. And that's what it happens in Yara. People is still listening music and selling their products on at the side of the road and things like that. It's like life goes on, but the moment the player uh, take the stand as a guerrilla to overthrow the regime, is when start engaging in combat, and it goes both ways, of course.
that's insightful and really appreciate that we got the opportunity to dig into that. I didn't hear about that ahead of time. We didn't think about that. So I think this is going to be a highlight of this interview. So thank you for that. As we round out the discussion, as you start looking at where the games industry is moving, some of the future, where things are going next, what do you see out there as interesting, either interesting things where games are going to move, where audio and sound design is going to have a big part of it, or where new challenges that you're looking forward to, either at Ubisoft in the next game? I'm sure more games are being thought about, but the even the technology, artificial intelligence, are any of these tools sort of sparking what you foresee as things really changing in the games industry?
I think the challenge is not technological. Tech is a tool. There are very good movies done with a 16 millimeters camera or a cranked camera, and that done with a Panavision. And there are very excellent movies that are mono and movies that are Atmos, and they are good at the same. So it's a tool to tell the story. I think the real challenge in the video game industry is to create more mature stories, more stories that represent more people. So we evolved from the bro culture, the
Mm-hmm.
typical 30-something white male superhero into tell stories about younger people, older people, people of color, people of different origins. It's not about killing zombies anymore. So I think that the frontier is to represent the player and tell uh, stories or introduce gameplay mechanic that to tell those stories in an interesting way. And at least this type of game. Not every game needs to be story driven.
Right.
Tetris is a
Right.
great game, and I can play it forever. But
Right.
in these games, yeah, I think we grew up with games, and we became adults, and we became grown-up adults, and we need the content to adapt to our reality. I like to see a 50 or 50 something years old guy doing something and say, I would do the same. I grab that controller, and even if I'm not the player, and it hasn't to be a mirror, but I need to relate in a way to, there's a character that is a father of 3 children, and the mother has to immigrate somewhere, and he has to provide. There's a lot of more mature stories that can be told through games, and the 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 tech is a tool. You have more triangles, so you have better facial expressions, and I know I want more games to make me cry the same way movies make me cry.
I think games have a really unique position in being able to tell those mature, adult, advanced kind of stories in some ways that aren't available to theater or
Right.
movies as much, because you're putting the player into the shoes of the main character. You're making them the main character, and that opportunity for them to see how the rest of the world reacts to them and feel that from a first person perspective, I think is a whole new way to experience a narrative story of any
Yeah,
kind.
it's
Uh,
the evolution of the language. When the first movies start coming up, now people were more used to books or radio plays, and the whole idea was don't tell it, show it. So the audiovisual language was evolving. And I think the next step is don't show it, play it. So
Mm-hmm.
the game can introduce you in the story through smart gameplay, and that you can keep pulling that thread and getting into the game, and through the mechanics. And why not difficulty levels and everything, and or accessibility for everyone. If you're a bad player, and in terms of mechanical reflex and skills, you also should be able to go through the game and enjoy it, through proper um, difficulty levels and accessibility. So for me, that is the future of games, games for everyone.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I'm inspired by that too.
I like that evolution from don't tell it, show it, don't show it, play it. And I think that's a tagline that we're gonna quote you on that and put that
Anytime,
out there.
royalty
So
free.
this is Eduardo's advice to the world. All right, to really wrap it up, what do you do for fun outside of creating games and working at Ubisoft? What inspires you? What fun things do you on the side that either provide you release or bring some new angle to the art that you create?
I like to nurture from all different type of art. I like art galleries. I like paintings. I'm a big movie buff. I I like to play also small games, indie games. I've been playing mostly indie games lately, um, uh, but I'm not an only indoor person. I like to ride my bicycle around the city, being by the lakeshore. Toronto is a wonderful city, and for fun is travel and know new people. Every people, like just talking to you is for me worth the day. I'm done. I knew I knew new
Oh, we
people,
appreciate it.
and that is what it keeps me going.
Excellent. Well, that sounds really fun. In terms of talking to people, this is a thing we've been asking a couple of the guests that we've talked to. If you had to meet someone or work with someone or be on a panel in the games industry with someone else that inspires you in gaming, is there a name out there that you would throw out that you would say, I want to talk to, I want to sit down with XYZ person?
I, you know, a month ago, I had the honor of being Bafta nominated, and I went to London for the
Congratulations.
ceremony and everything, and I met other developers, let's say from PlayStation Studios. We are all doing the same, but not exactly in the same way. But what keep us motivated are pretty much the same thing. So it's not a big name or like a heavy hitter. Like of course there are creative director like Neil Druckmann or Cory Balrog, and that are outstanding. But every developer out there I found and I talked to is teaching me something. It could be a lesson. It could be a life lesson. Uh, but uh, probably because so many years of film, I'm not so starstruck.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah, or struck star. I don't really know. Sorry. Then
Yeah, that's right.
the regular worker in this industry, that we share a lot of views about how we make this industry better, what are our hurdles, and everything is inspiring in a way.
That's
Excellent.
awesome.
Well, we appreciate that. We're certainly inspired by being able to talk to you.
My pleasure.
This has been an amazing conversation. We really appreciate your time here today. If people should certainly go out and play Far Cry 6 and Far Cry Next, whatever comes next in the future, to experience that work. I would highly recommend that. I had a lot of fun doing it myself. If people wanted to reach out to you or hear more about your work, where could they go do that?
Well, I mostly active in Twitter. My name is Ed Vaisman, all together, and I have my direct messages open all the time. I mentor new sound designers or people in general
Why am I not surprised?
around the world, here in Canada, and people from Argentina, Bolivia, and Mexico, and there's people reach out, and I like to reach out people, so anyone can not a star.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate that. We're going to stay connected. We'll stay connected on Twitter and elsewhere. Certainly going to want to hear about what comes next. And we want to, again, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you.
This has been a New Overlords production. For more, please visit newoverlords.com for video, subscribe and feed links, and other ways to help the show.